Good evening, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to the 2018 Mitsubishi Sustainability Lecture. My name is Michael Hitch, and I'm Director of the Australian Centre for Sustainable Mining Practices and an Associate Professor at the School of Minerals and Minerals and Energy Resources Engineering. Anyway, in welcoming you, I'd like to show my respect and acknowledge the Bendigo people, the traditional custodians of the land. I'd also like to pay my respects to elders, both past and present, and to extend my respect to other Aboriginal peoples and Torres Strait Islanders that may be present with us today. Before we get started, I'd like to remind you that we're going to be running a very interesting Q&A after the presentation today using technology, using Slido, which those of you that attend town halls here at the university or dean's messages, you should be pretty familiar with them. To submit your questions online, you'll be asked to go to, or you've got a little slip of paper on your chair actually that gives you the directions, but it's www.slido.com and enter the event code, hashtag ACSMP 2018. And what happens is that over the course of the presentation tonight, you can enter your questions or any thoughts or any ideas, and what will happen is it'll be uploaded, and if you and you'll be able to see the other questions. So if there's a question or a comment that really appeals to you and you really kind of like it, do the thumbs up. You don't do the thumbs up because that's distracting, but push the thumbs up bit on your phone or your device, and that actually prioritizes the question and moves it to the top of the queue. Just for those of you that want to do something unsavory with the questions, we do have somebody editing and censoring them, so be aware. Tonight's lecture is very interesting. It's actually going to be a very fascinating insight into the impacts and opportunities that are provided or going to happen for us as a result of what's known as the fourth industrial revolution, and in particular how these technologies are reshaping our world. Our speaker tonight is a very interesting guy in his own right. He's an expert in his area. He leads the World Economic Forum's work on the fourth industrial revolution. He focuses on how emerging technologies are disrupting industries, labor markets, societies, governments, and how technology can be used to empower communities to create a more human-centered future. He is the forum head of Society and Innovation at the World Economic Forum. He's a member of the executive committee and responsible for the forum's global NGO. And he also looks after labor and faith communities as well. With Klaus Schwab, the founder and executive chairman of the World Economic Forum, he is the co-author of Shaping the Fourth Industrial Revolution, which was published in January of 2018. Our speaker is originally from Sydney, so he's a homeboy, so you'll be able to understand what he says. And he's got more than 15 years experience in economic analysis, strategy, foresight, technology, policy, and private and public partnerships. He's worked as a commercial lawyer, director at Oxford Investment Research, and was the World Economic Forum's leader for Europe. He's a certified professional facilitator and a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts in the UK. And he sits on the board of Improve, which is a European Innovation Management Academy, and is an associate of the fellow of the Geneva Center for Security Policy. He holds degrees in arts and law from the University of Sydney, as well as a Master's of Business Administration from Oxford. But he's not here. Tonight we're doing something very interesting, and it's the first time that it's ever been done at UNSW, that we're going to be streaming from Geneva. We are going to be live streaming to the internet as a whole, and I think hopefully we're going to have Nick on an iPad after to be able to, you can actually have private conversations with him and ask him not personal questions, but questions one-on-one when the time comes. We actually offered him an airplane ticket to escape dreary springtime Geneva and come to the autumn of Sydney. But he responded saying, well, I could do that for an hour, or I could walk the walk and save the carbon credits and the carbon emissions that it would take to fly for an hour-long meeting to Sydney. So really this was Nick's idea to move forward and do the presentation this way. So without further ado, I would love to give a very warm welcome to Mr. Nicholas Davis.
Good evening, and thank you so much for having me via video link in Sydney at the University of New South Wales. And can I say thank you very much to the university and all the partners of this Mitsubishi Minerals Sustainability lecture for allowing me to beam in to talk about the promise and peril of the fourth industrial revolution. My work at the World Economic Forum here in Geneva, but also at our other offices around the world, really focuses on the intersection between technology, particularly emerging technologies, and social impact. And so the discussion that I wanted to bring today to you, and hopefully in the time that we'll have to discuss after this, is really around the question of what is the role of sustainability in talking about emerging technologies, and why at the forum and elsewhere around the world are we using this phrase, the fourth industrial revolution. So over the next half an hour or so, I'll be presenting a few ideas in around 4 different parts, but I guess in kind of tried and true fashion, I want to start, and here on slide 2, if you have the visuals in front of you, are really the key messages for what I'm going to talk about today. The first one is really to impress upon all of us the fact that the world is undergoing huge change. You can say unprecedented, but really by the way we've defined it, it is precedented in terms of the fact that previous industrial revolutions have occurred. And really that change is around the way that value is being created, exchanged and distributed. And this is driven not solely, but in large part by technologies of the fourth industrial revolution. The second key point is that values and ethics matter here, because the way that we redesign and design new systems of production and consumption reflects and embeds our values and principles into the systems around us, into infrastructure. So huge opportunities in that, but also massive responsibility, because those choices we make today will constrain and channel our future options as well as those of future generations. And my third point, which I think many of you will take for granted, but it's important in this argumentation, is that sustainability itself is an ethical stance. So sustainability is not simply a set of outcomes that we think are independent of human desire. They're actually a set of judgments, of values, and a set of sustainability principles that we really need to think of as a core design principle as we build new technologies and infrastructure. And my final point in this lecture will be around the fact that leadership needs to change in this era. And here, the World Economic Forum, being the international organization for public-private cooperation, will stick to its line of saying that leadership should be inspiring global society to work together. And that can come across as a platitude. On what do we need to work together? In particular, I'm going to argue that we need to work together in terms of how we invest, how we educate, how we debate, and how we govern new technologies. So first of all, what is the fourth industrial revolution? Well, we've deliberately chosen this phrase, and you can see there the image on slide 4 on the top left of the steam engine. We've chosen the phrase the fourth industrial revolution very consciously to recall an era of historical changes in the ways, not just that manufacturing worked, but in the way that society operated. And the first industrial revolution, which began in Great Britain around 1750, progressed over the course of about a century, started really with the reimagining of how fossil fuel concentrated and used in an engine form could lead to mechanization, could combine with precision and machine tooling, could unleash powers of production, which led to the specialization of labor, and resulted not just in cheaper materials, new materials, but entire new business models and ways of working, indeed the factory system. And behind that, you will also see huge changes in the minerals sector. You'll see significant changes in the way that iron was produced, and significant changes in which natural resources were consumed as a result over that period of time. And people's lives changed fundamentally over those 100 years. A huge majority of the population, the working population, which had 100, in 1750, had its daily rhythm dictated by the sounds of agriculture, the crowing of the cock and the rhythms of the seasons and the sun, literally changed within a couple of generations into getting up, going to work, coming home to the sound of a factory whistle. The second industrial revolution we talk about less, but the scientists and political scientists and commentator and polymath Václav Smil talked a huge amount about in his recent books, which I highly recommend, particularly Creating the 20th Century. This era between around 1870 and the First World War, 1914, where again a huge range of different scientific inventions came to fruition in ways that fundamentally transformed how we communicate, how we move, how we produce, how we consume. And that era was really responsible for, the modern world as we see it, as we experience it. And if you look around the lecture theatre in which you're sitting today, it is a product of the second industrial revolution. The internal combustion engine, new methods of making steel, telecommunications, electricity, all of this was brought about in that era. And it was unimaginable without the previous era of steam and railroads and railway on global commerce unleashed by the first industrial revolution, but it was fundamentally different from that period, again, 100 years earlier. And what I might add, because we're talking here in the context of minerals and sustainability, the breakthrough and the system breakthrough that is probably of greatest note and yet least remarked of that era is the synthesis, the artificial synthesis of ammonia. Without the ability for us to fix nitrogen in that way, without the Haber-Bosch synthesis process, we would not be able to have 7 billion people on the planet today. So these fundamental breakthroughs, they feel scientific, but they're actually systematic in nature, and they unleash whole new ways of working and being. The third industrial revolution, there in the bottom left-hand corner of slide 4, is really the digital revolution. It began in the 1940s, the early 1940s, but harks back a couple of thousand years in other ways, and it refers to these breakthroughs in the ways in which we transform knowledge, the way in which we process, we store, we communicate information. And so I think that digital process is still ongoing today, but it's very important to then think about how that is shifting our perception of the world. It's changing the channels with which we engage with the world around us. So the fourth industrial revolution comes after that, and I guess I want to mention the reason why we chose the fourth industrial revolution as a phrase is because it is evoking what has yet to come. And it also invokes a series of systems which build on the previous revolutions. So just as electricity is impossible without steam power that came before it, and similarly, digital communication is impossible without electricity and without our understanding of Maxwell's laws, telecommunications, wireless, Shannon's theory and other aspects. So too the fourth industrial revolution, where we talk about a whole series of technologies from artificial intelligence and robotics to blockchain and biotechnologies, these build on the digital revolution in entirely the same way. They take for granted this processing power, this telecommunications power, this ability to make sense of the world that was given to us in the course of the last 60, 70 years as the digital world has developed and emerged. I want to pause for a second, and this next slide, slide 5, is a picture of one of the kind of emblematic pieces of technology of the first industrial revolution, right at the end of the first industrial revolution, the Spinning Mule. It's a textile device. And I want us to kind of reflect on the fact that when we think of industrial revolutions and we think of major change in this area, we inevitably start by looking at the technologies themselves. And we start to ask ourselves, well, what does this mean? What does this feel like as a technology? What does it imply? But when you switch from slide 5 to slide 6, you can see here, this is not a picture of the spinning mule as an engine, as a piece of a mechanism that creates, that weaves in different ways. This is an image of the workers who are engaged in that production process, and they're all children apart from one overseer. And so when you look at the system of production that came out of this, we have to include the human being at the center of all these discussions and all our reflections. And that's why when we talk about the fourth industrial revolution, we talk about a human-centered revolution, human-centered technology. We want to consciously look for the people, whether they're directly or indirectly affected by technology, how they're being empowered, how they're being disempowered, how their rights are being affected, and where they gain and where they lose in these discussions and these evolutions. And you may very well know that child labour laws only arose out of the first industrial revolution because children's fingers and were nimble enough to operate within the constraints of that technology that was developed at the time. So looking forward, the fourth industrial revolution, and now looking here at some headlines on slide 7, these technologies range from how lasers can revolutionize technology, revolutionize computing, through to brain implants and the possibility to augment ourselves, the use by state and non-state actors to monitor individuals, including students, as in the case of a number of schools. The fact that education is being reformed in very many ways with new courses and new ways of transmitting learning, and even an increasing number of threats from the proliferation of these devices around the world. In the case where hackers stole a casino's database through a thermometer in the lobby fish tank. So new vulnerabilities that are emerging thanks to these technologies. I mentioned a few of them before. It's very hard to create a list that is mutually exclusive and completely exhaustive, but if you wanted to, you could divide them into 4 large categories. So those technologies where the current digital world is evolving and expanding in interesting ways. New computing, such as quantum computing. We look at the kind of the breakthroughs in artificial intelligence, etc. You can then start to think about the ways in which that digital world is emerging and affecting the real world in new ways, whether that be in the Internet of Things or 3D printing and robotics. You can then start to look at where new technologies are physically changing the human space in more or less direct ways. Virtual reality and augmented reality in many senses, but biotechnologies, and personally the scariest I find is neurotechnologies and brain implants, which are making great strides. And then finally a whole set of technologies which are at the systems level, so geoengineering, technologies around the energy systems, and indeed space technologies as well. So just to kind of get the sense of what we mean when we talk about the fourth industrial revolution, those are the domains of technologies which build on the digital revolution that are creating opportunities to change and create value in new ways. And these technologies are scarily capable in many senses. Narrowly capable, I have to say, but scarily capable. And here on slide 8, if you have the chance to see this, this is from two sets of images from the Future of Humanity Institute's recent and excellent report on the malicious use of AI. On the left there is a graph showing the increasing, or the decreasing error rate of image recognition algorithms. The dotted line there is going across the bottom is the human error rate. So our best algorithms as of the last 2 years are better than humans at correctly identifying individuals from photos. And on the right is the opposite. There are 4 photos there starting in 2014 and coming to last year, which are algorithms creating false human faces from databases of other faces. 2014, a fairly simple, relatively low resolution and quite symmetrical image. And then 2017, haven't I seen that person in a TV show somewhere? So if we were to summarize what is the fourth industrial revolution, it's definitely a set of emerging industrial capabilities. It's also a societal transformation. And more than that, the World Economic Forum wants the discussion on this not to focus just on the technologies, but rather on it being an inclusive mental model. What Sheila Jasanoff from the Harvard Kennedy School might call a socio-technological imaginary, which is STS speak for really an aspirational way of thinking and looking at the world. And I will make sure that throughout this, when we talk about minerals and sustainability, that we appreciate the fourth industrial revolution is also a governance challenge. It's a demand for us to step up and create new norms and new rules that go along with these emerging industrial capabilities according to our own values and ethics. So what is the link with sustainability? Well, on slide 11, I think it's important to recognize that whenever we talk about technology, we are confronting three large myths. Three large myths that we often reference in discussions with one another, and also that we'll see in the media every day. The first one, and these are all dangerous by the way, the first one is that it's all about the technologies and they alone determine our future. And I think it's really important to recognize that the technologies are part of the story, but how we use those technologies is equally important, and the institutions and the rules and norms we put around them are incredibly powerful. Calestis Juma, the late Calestis Juma, another Harvard scholar and a fantastic Kenyan thought leader in this area, he wrote this fantastic book, Innovation and Its Enemies, which goes back in time and looks at more than a dozen technologies around us where the way society reacted had huge impacts on how and when we used it in different ways. The second myth is that the change is unstoppable, and I think that again this is something that is not true. It's not a question of only accepting and getting on board with technology. And Calestis and other scholars in this area, as well as our daily fight against the use of technology in our homes and our understanding of how important it is for us to make better habits about our use of technology, is not something that we have to give up on. And the final myth that people talk about and we maybe think less about is this idea that technologies are value neutral. Now, this is something you might recall from the gun debate when people say guns don't kill people, people kill people. This is exactly that argument. The argument is that the guns themselves are value neutral. It's only with an active actor, a moral actor in the person of a human being, that suddenly ethics and values come into the picture. Maybe this was the view in science technology studies a few decades ago, maybe 30, 40 years. There's a wealth of research and a wealth of intuition here that technologies actually embed our values in a very deep way. You can look at this, whether it be the case of whether the residents of Bondi Beach would like to have a train line taking people to the beach. The question of a train line going to Bondi Beach and the decisions around that, what that means for the residents of Bondi, is not just an ethical question, it's an intensely political question, and has proven to be over the years. And one of the classic case studies in a similar way on public infrastructure as a technology comes from the design of the bridges in New York, the bridges that crossed over the major highways in New York leading to Long Island, which were, in the analysis of around the life of Robert Moses, were deliberately too low to prevent the city buses that took low-income populations around the city, so that they would not be able to access those communities and beaches in Long Island. And of course, we've had many years of discussions about the non-neutrality of weapons systems and elements like the atom bomb. So I think that we just need to remember that the technologies we build are not devoid of our ethics and values. Rather, they actually encode and reflect what we want from the world around us. Three big questions then that come up whenever we talk about technology. One of them is who gains? Who are the winners from the technologies and the systems we're building? And the corollary of that, of course, is who loses? Who's bearing the externalities in these systems? And finally, a really important question is what role do we have to play? Where is the human being here, as described on slide 12? And finally, when we come to this discussion of ethics and morality, the question is for whom? So I talked about human-centered, I talked about the element of who gains and who loses. Three groups of stakeholders which we at the World Economic Forum really try hard to include in different ways, but which are very difficult to include in many senses. Firstly, everyday society and citizens outside of those powerful groups that are designing and investing in technologies. Secondly, emerging economies and developing economies and groups of people, political leaders and citizens in those countries who feel that they are takers of technology to a great extent rather than makers of technology. And thirdly, the environment itself. So now I come to the third part of this lecture, which is to start to switch from talking about what the framework for technology and ethics is, and to ask, well, what is the promise and what is the peril for sustainability when it comes to technology and the fourth industrial revolution? And I'll quickly then just throw up an analysis that we've done here in Geneva on the opportunities related to the Sustainable Development Goals linked purely to digital solutions. So not linked to new materials, not linked to solutions around geoengineering, not linked to work around necessarily the world of robotics or even biotechnology, but purely just digital solutions, and that first category I mentioned earlier. And this came up with a number of big numbers in terms of the volume of CO2 from global emissions that can be saved, 12.1 gigatons, huge volumes of water, 300 kilometers cubed, and a large amount of other energy offsets, as well as GDP growth that can be gained. And it's important for us that when we talk about the future of technology, we do link it to frameworks of governance and goals and objectives that are shared by the international community. And the SDG framework is one that is driving a huge amount of our discussion in technology development. It's one where, in fact, we are structuring an entire conversation in collaboration with our friends at the UN and our many corporate and civil society partners in New York in September this year, as we did last year. So if that's the promise, the peril is starting to get touched upon in slide 16. And this is a focus on the global risks landscape overall. This is an annual survey that we do of risk experts, around about 1,000 different risk experts from different countries in the world. We try and get a good spread of those experts. And the top 10 risks in terms of likelihood, you can see there, really linked to the environment. Number 1 and number 3 being tightly linked to the environment. Number 1, extreme weather events. Number 3, natural disasters. And in terms of impact, we actually have 3 of the top 5 being environmental related: extreme weather events, natural disasters, and the failure of climate change mitigation and adaptation. Which says to me that in the global risks, in the peril of the fourth industrial revolution, the major peril is of us not acting to deal with the risks that have been created by previous industrial revolutions. Dealing with risks that come from the externalities of our fossil fuel use, the externalities of the way that our systems and institutions have been set up in perhaps ways that are not collaborative enough. So that's a really interesting call to action for any discussion of technology, is to think that it's not enough just to go for the technology as an end in itself, but mitigating these risks must be a part of the ethical stance of technology development. When we look at the timing of these global risks, it's very interesting to note that in the next 18 months, none of those major environmental risks show up. Instead, it's around migration, and of course this is all very sensitive to the time at which it's taken, but interstate conflict, unemployment, failure of national governance, yes, but no explicitly environmental risk in the top 5 for the 18 months. When you look 10 years, it's water crises, it's failure of climate change mitigation, extreme weather, it's food crises, and highly correlated to that, profound social instability. We have a timing problem with technology. We have a timing problem with governance. When we look into the short term, we're excited by the new, we're focused on the immediate, but the risks in the sustainability and environmental area, the risks in the resource area, are ones that are slow burning, they're challenging to deal with, and they're ones where we need a different set of incentives. So that was on slide 17. On slide 18, I do want to take a point that there are a number of global trends in resource extraction that are important for us to remark on. There are naturally a huge skew in resource use and demand towards emerging markets, and in this case towards Asia and the Pacific. So the graph on the left, and these are both from the internet, these graphs are from the International Resource Panel report 2016. You can see there the major shift up to 2017 of demand and consumption in millions of tons for Asia and the Pacific compared to the rest of the world. And probably more scary than that is the graph on the right, which compares labour productivity, energy productivity, and material productivity. The key takeaway from that graph is the fall in material productivity since the year 2000. The fact that we are not we're not achieving the decoupling that is necessary between material and GDP growth, that we need to make sure that the sustainability of our systems is managed appropriately. And I kind of also wanted to say here that when it comes to the economic discussions then of the impact of climate change, of resource use, of how we manage these systems in light of future generations, these may look like they're scientific or actuarial or pure economic analyses, but what we're looking at here are deeply ethical and political challenges and issues. And I often go back here to the debate around the Stern Review. So the Stern Review was, of course, Lord Stern's review of the economic impact and the cost of mitigation of climate change that he completed in 2005-2006. And the debate amongst economists, including where I work at the World Economic Forum, and I joined the World Economic Forum in 2006, was not about whether Nick Stern was right around the magnitude of impacts that would occur, nor was it around whether or not technologies or policies might change to help or hinder mitigation efforts over time. The major concern was his choice of discount rate. It was his choice of how to value future generations. And I'm sure you'll be very familiar with the fact that the higher the discount rate, the higher the interest rate we place on investments and costs and opportunities today, the lower we value the future. And the reason that is because if we think the discount rate is high, then we assume that future generations will be far richer to deal with the problems that we have today. In other words, we need to invest less today because future generations will inevitably be better off by virtue of that discount rate. Nick Stern chose an average. It was a complicated formula, but he chose an average of about 1.4% for that discount rate. Many economists disagreed and said it should be around 3%. 3% discount rate means that in 25 years you'll be about twice as wealthy as you would today if you place a dollar in today. It implies that the future generations are half as valuable to us in 25 years when compared to a discount rate of 0. I just wanted to make this point to say that is not an economic question. It has economic ramifications, but it is an ethical question. And in fact, Hal Varian, the chief economist of Google, who commentated on this at the time, said, look, there is no right answer. This is a question, it's a political and ethical question, the discount rate you provide for future generations. And I think that that's an important note to keep in mind because when we're talking here about trends in resource extraction, when we're talking about the technologies we require to put in place and develop for the future, we are talking about ethical questions. And looking at slide 19, if you think about the systems level impact of new technology, the Paris climate targets said that we need 100 million electric vehicles on the road to meet the goals. We had 2 million electric vehicles on the road in 2016. That's a 50 times increase to achieve the Paris climate targets. We need wind and solar to represent more than 80% of global renewable capacity growth. It looks like we're going to hit that, but we need that to accelerate. And in the next couple of years, we'll have 6 billion smartphones circulating in the world, representing around about 60% of all the smart connected consumer electronic devices. These things are driving major changes in raw material needs. They're not always driving the changes that people talk about. And so many of you will know far better than me, being directly in the minerals industry, that while lithium demand will continue to go up, demand in other areas will rise faster. In this case, nickel is a primary input for the cathode in lithium batteries, lithium-driven batteries, and this will be an increasing requirement in terms of the material intensity per kilowatt hour. We need to make sure that we're looking at these bigger pictures in the context of what can be provided in a sustainable way. And at the same time, the emerging tech itself is having environmental costs and impacts. Slide 21 is the graph taken from just the other day on the estimated energy consumption for the proof of work behind Bitcoin. So the Bitcoin algorithm, which is a blockchain process, it is using computing power every day to generate and verify the transactions that are happening around the world. The estimated terawatt hour per year of that now is currently around about 67 terawatt hours. That's about on level with the Czech Republic as an entire country. That's a significant cost, and that's one that's going up as the Bitcoin blockchain expands. It's also a cost that's inherent to the system that many people are trying to solve, but it will require not just ingenuity, but a systems shift within the standards of the blockchain and the Bitcoin blockchain in particular. What are we doing to start to solve these aspects? Well, it goes back to my point around the need for public-private collaboration. And one global public-private partnership we launched recently is specifically around this idea of thinking about the way that raw materials reuse in the circular economy sense, and innovation around the battery value chain will be able to drive more sustainable outcomes for a whole range of public and private partners. And so the Global Battery Alliance is one of the forum's approaches to thinking about this intersection between new technologies, new business models, new resource demands, and finally, new configurations of innovators working together to drive into a direction which is a specific set of ethical choices around the sustainability of that value chain. So I want to go into a few other examples which are much more specific to technology themselves. One example that comes from Australia, one that I'm actually very excited about because here at the forum we're working with Geoscience Australia and the group on Earth observations to try and bring this at a continent level to the continent of Africa, is the Open Data Cube. And so you may not have heard of this, but the Open Data Cube is an Australian code base that looks to use Earth observation data, so satellite data, but use it in a novel way. Rather than creating an open library of JPEG images, of images which are static and have to be investigated, interpreted one at a time, pioneered firstly by the Government of Australia, by Geoscience Australia, is an open platform to host a whole range of, and in fact the whole continent of Australia, pixel by pixel based on Landsat and now soon Sentinel data, to be able to allow anyone in the country to run algorithms and investigate what is happening on the ground in an almost real-time capacity. So this is rethinking the way that data coming down from space can be used by farmers, by companies, by individuals, by communities, by local governments. And if you go to the Open Data Cube site, if you look at the Digital Earth site, Digital Earth Australia, and other related sites in Geoscience Australia, you'll be able to see that this technology is being opened up and used to track rehabilitation of vegetation after sand mining in Queensland. It's being used by farmers to estimate crop coverage and think about irrigation strategies field by field down at the pixel level. And it's also been used to look at erosion and even water quality, simply because you have the power of an open platform that you can then run a variety of very smart algorithms, including the latest machine learning algorithms on that data. There's also been a huge amount of discussion around where blockchain is going for social impact. Now, blockchain is at an incredible point in the hype cycle, and I guess the one thing that, having run a number of blockchain projects myself, the one piece of kind of informal advice I would give for anyone who's embarking on them, on this yourself, is to make sure that you start with the problem and look for to see how blockchain might provide a solution, rather than starting with the solution of being blockchain and looking for a problem to solve in your organization. But the Stanford Center for Social Innovation did look at a whole range of different social impact blockchain projects at the beginning of this year and the end of that last year. And they found around 200 catalogued initiatives, most of which were in health. But you can see from that graph on slide 25 that a significant proportion were in energy, climate and environment, agriculture, land rights. The interesting thing, which goes back to the risks profile graph that I put up before, when you think about the payback of a new technology in social impact terms, the question of when do you expect that payback to come was longest and most uncertain when it came to energy, climate and the environment. So again, we have a bit of an incentive problem when it comes to the sustainability aspect in that regard. On slide 26, a celebrated example from a couple of years ago was the fact that Google's DeepMind AI, and you might remember that Google acquired DeepMind for a considerable sum, a few $100 million British pounds. Applying the Google DeepMind deep learning algorithm to data center energy use reduced Google's cooling bill in its data centers by 40%. It reduced the overall energy consumption by 15% for Google's data centers. This is a recurring yearly saving in the order perhaps of close to 100 million pounds. 3% of global energy is currently consumed by data centers around the world. It's rising as a percentage of energy use. Being able to apply artificial intelligence algorithms, machine learning and other optimizing algorithms, including people hope soon quantum computing approaches, has a huge opportunity to optimize energy systems in new way, and indeed material consumption systems. So I firmly put this on the promise side of emerging technology. And perhaps on a smaller scale is trying to address the challenge of recycling by using picking methods and sorting methods driven by AI and robotics. And AMP Robotics is one of the firms that was awarded a circular award by the World Economic Forum and our network of young global leaders at the beginning of this year. Here is a company that's looking to leverage those algorithms and emerging robotic use cases to basically be able to solve the challenge of mixed waste flows for the end of life challenge for material consumption. So when we zoom out of all of this and we think, okay, this sounds great, we've got lots of interesting specific technologies that can be applied. How do we make sense of the fact of what needs to happen now? And this is where I'm going to conclude and go to discussion, because I know I've presented a large set of different ideas and examples in the short time we've had together. But I want to make sure that we realize that inequality is a huge issue here. The greatest social injustice of industrial revolutions is that they are not equally distributed. We have about 1 billion people who are still defecating outdoors. Sanitation, clean water and sanitation is not reliably provided to over 2 billion people. The technology and the processes, the institutions and the norms around defecation, which are massively correlated to public health, were breakthroughs in the second industrial revolution, and yet we still have 1 billion people who are suffering from public health crises and issues related to basic sanitation. So this is the fact that I really want to kind of say that there are still 4 billion people who don't have access to the internet. We have 1.2 billion people without access to electricity around the world. We still have a long way to go in making sure that the previous industrial revolutions are delivering their promise to populations around the world. And on the other hand, we are seeing a worrying range of case studies here related to perhaps social sustainability rather than environmental sustainability on how emerging technologies are being applied to people. And Virginia Eubank's excellent book, Automating Inequality, gives 3 very harrowing case studies of how marginalized populations, poorer populations, are really being directly disempowered by emerging technologies in ways that will inevitably be applied to the rest of us, but which should worry us just by the fact that that is the experience of an increasing proportion of those around us, our fellow citizens in the countries we live, but also outside our own communities. I also want to mention the fact that these are not solutions which should be driven by one particular technology. There's no panacea magic bullet. We must take a systems approach and think, particularly in terms of minerals sustainability, around the circular supply chain, around platforms for sharing and reuse, around new business models, around product life extension, and around new incentives and models for recovery and recycling. And that's detailed there on slide 30. And slide 31 is just a bit of a rundown of some work that we've done with our partners on a platform for accelerating the circular economy. In my kind of penultimate point, I want to say that, I mentioned at the beginning, it's about investment, it's about education. It's really also around governance. And we do have a major challenge, something that I think many of you recognize, that traditional governance models, which are periodic, specialized, fragmented, focused on rules, reliant on monitoring and concentrated around power, are not up to scratch for starting to address some of the challenges that we've talked about and that I've highlighted ahead. We need more agile forms of governance which are more responsive, more differentiated and interoperable, focused on outcomes and reliant on a different form of incentives, including more market motivations, where markets do better, and they don't always do better. This kind of approach to governance is critically important. We need to go beyond just a focus on international conventions or even international organizations like the World Economic Forum, and think of new models for bringing parties together, hybrid models, as well as recognizing the increasing importance that corporate policies, the private sector and foundations are having on this space. So if I were to say then, well, what should we all do? I guess I want to close by saying the first thing that we can all do is we can keep 4 principles in mind. When looking at sustainability in the 4th Industrial Revolution, firstly, we should make sure that we are thinking about the systems rather than focusing just on the technologies. The technologies are super sexy, they're super interesting, they're what makes for interesting stories at parties, and I should know that. But they're not this, they don't produce the social impact in themselves. It's in a systems perspective that we need to look at these things. The second, and this really starts to get to this ethical stance that I was talking about, is we really should be talking, evaluating, discussing technologies as to how much they empower us, how much they empower other communities, and how they enhance our options, augment us, give us more power, give us better ways to make decisions. The moment we feel that we are being determined and controlled and managed, or when we think that we're investing or educating or governing systems so that they determine other people's lives, I think we should be very worried. Even if we think the outcome is ultimately good, people are not means, people are ends. This is a really important ethical stance. Human-centered technology, human-centered design says we put the human being as the end, not as a mean to some bigger other goal. And in that, the third principle I'd say is that this has to be by design and not by default. We live at a time of major technological and economic and political social change. It is our responsibility, by virtue of living today, that we have these conversations as we're doing today, and that we make the changes that we think will drive us in that direction. And finally, this final principle uses the language of software design. So it's a 3rd industrial revolution lexicon to express a 4th industrial revolution aspiration. But values need to be a feature rather than a bug of these systems. We need to bring the discussion of ethics back to the center of technology as a feature, as something that we want to deliberately come out of things, not as something that's a bug that we just have to solve for. In other words, we shouldn't be designing a million systems and then screening them for which ones might hurt people, or just thinking once we find out that dating app was used by a certain sect to eliminate and commit violence against another religious group, rather than thinking, oh gosh, isn't that a bad thing, that was a bug in the system. We need to be thinking about the way we invest, the way we educate, the way we govern, the way we talk, and the way we discuss, with values as a core feature of these technologies. So I'll finish then by saying that a lot of the discussion in the world of sustainability, a lot of the discussion around the fourth industrial revolution in the tech sector is around technology leadership. And a huge amount of what many universities will say is the most important thing is for us to be at the forefront of technology leadership. I guess I would just say, yes, that's true, but it is by no means sufficient. We need to marry technology leadership with governance leadership. We need to be innovating as much on how we work and manage and control and enhance and augment these technologies for the purposes of humans, rather than thinking it's all around the technology and the governance will come naturally afterwards. It won't. We've learnt that before. The major lags in governance of technology in previous industrial revolutions have shown that. We want to be on the front foot with the fourth industrial revolution, which means a lot deeper investment in the governance of technology in a positive way, rather than worrying about it as a scary thing, as if it's regulation and it's inevitably closing down our options. We also need to make sure that we are really pushing forward in values leadership. And I think this should be the golden age for philosophy education, not for philosophy education purely in the ivory tower kind of isolated sense of a language of philosophy that's purely mathematical, but it should be the golden age for ethics, which is in the vernacular, it's relatable, it focuses on a whole variety of different ethical stances, phenomenological, epistemological, ontological, for making sense of the world such that it is able for us to have really intensive and productive conversations with one another all across society. And if it means getting rid of all those words I just said, so much more the better. And finally, this all wraps up in what the World Economic Forum calls systems leadership. So for us, systems leadership is being able to zoom in and understand the human experience, understand where business models and individual organizations are striving for change, and zooming out to understand where broad trends, technology, laws, regulation, aspirations of different nation states and communities, changing values all come together to push in the direction of where we want to go. And that's, for me, the call to action in terms of how lectures like this, and again, thank you so much for having me, audiences like yourselves and institutions like the World Economic Forum need to do better about having productive conversations. So thank you very much for inviting me today, and I look forward to continuing the discussion in the question and answer period now.
Thank you very much, Nick. That was a remarkable presentation. It certainly gave us a lot of food for thought. The notion of systems, I think, is critical, that we're no longer living in a linear world, that one thing leads to another, whereas it's a series of systems and interconnected systems that really pulls us together. The comments you made are the bullet points you put around leadership. You could take each one of those and blend it into that whole definition of sustainability, even the Brundtland definition that we all hold so near and dear, and really kind of incorporate those things into how we embrace sustainability, not only in our own personal lives, but also how we carry out the business that we do. So this brings us to the ultra cool part. This was just the warm-up. This is the next cool part, again, using technology in a friendly, safe way. But now it's time for the Q&A. Now, I've got this wonderful screen here, so I'm not really ignoring you, but I have to kind of pay attention and read this. So what's happened is that over the course of the talk, people have used the application, punched questions in, or have hit the thumbs up to promote an existing question to the top of the queue. So, you're free and welcome to add more questions or put thumbs up on anything that you want as we go along. So, some people are anonymous, and I will let you remain anonymous, but some people have names. So if you don't mind, I'm going to use your name. So Jon Snow has got a question for you, Nick. Why do you laugh? Is that like a funny name? There's got to be a Jon Snow out there somewhere. You stated that technology is value neutral. How does machine learning fit into this, and by extension, AI sentience?
This is a really important question because it gives me the opportunity to clarify the point. I actually don't believe that technology is value neutral. Technology is inherently political. And this is technology in the definition writ large. So you can see that a machine learning algorithm has built in it the assumption and biases of its creators in at least 3 different areas. So you have the bias of the training set. So there's a bias on exactly what data has been fed into it, whether that is supervised or unsupervised learning. That data set will be biased simply by the fact that it's a subsection or a selection of the world. Secondly, you're going to have biases in that data set or in the machine learning by the virtue of the choice of algorithm. If you're choosing a particular way of doing gradient descent versus an evolutionary approach, you're taking biases in terms of what information you're discarding at each step of the way. And the choice of how you manage your convolution, if you're using a CNN, is in itself a value judgment. And the third element is where you choose to use that algorithm and for the purposes for which you use it. You would argue that in the case of the Centrelink controversy, you would also could say that when you use an algorithm and you match it with other databases that are flawed, you create bias and discrimination in those areas as well. So the first thing to say is, I think the non-neutrality of technology is one of the most important topics of our time, and the recognition of how we increase the diversity and where we understand the bias and where that comes from is critical. I'll finish by just saying 2 things here. I don't know if anyone here lives in Bondi, but if you live in Bondi Beach, you may be aware of the history of residents voting against the extension of the train line down to the beach from the junction. That is a technology decision around infrastructure that is intensely political. And I don't want to draw comparisons here, but when we talk about the political nature of technologies, the classic case study here is the study in New York of the fact that New York, when it was designed by Robert Moses, was designed with a deliberately low height of overpasses on the major roads heading to Long Island. And the claim that's been made by a number of people, including taken from his own writings, is that the height of that was designed to prevent the buses that took minority communities from accessing the beaches of Long Island. So even when we just talk about a transportation technology, it can be consciously discriminatory and biased in ways that endures for generations. Or in the case of a recent example of a hand drying machine, an automated hand dryer that did not recognize dark skin in order to turn on, these technology design issues will be inherently values-based, whether we like it or not. So I want to make sure that in this element of machine learning that we address that. And in fact, it should be a core part, and it's starting to be a core part of some machine learning and AI courses, but needs to be much more front and center.
Thank you, Nick. Next question. How is the equal distribution of the 4th Industrial Revolution to be governed? A lot of the 2nd and 3rd still have not reached many areas.
Yeah, an absolutely critical question. People will argue that the answer is leapfrogging. So this is a phrase we hear a lot in the development sector, that it's all about leapfrogging. Unfortunately, when leapfrogging is consumption-based, it does not result in the sustainable economic gains that we expect of technology breakthroughs. So the example here is the mobile phone, and Calestis Juma The late Lester Stumer from Harvard has written a series of articles on this point. The mobile phone is held up as the great example of leapfrogging because it enabled communities to communicate with one another with a new generation of technology while skipping over landline usage. However, the economic gains from the mobile phone have not extended to the gains in innovation from the actual development and extension of those networks and the underlying technologies. And so here I think we need to make sure that as the fourth industrial revolution, if we would like the fourth industrial revolution, as I think we should, to penetrate areas outside of where the core and the kernel of technology.
Oh, no.
Apologies, it's a general internet outage on their side. We have Nick.
Nick, how's it going?
It's going well, Michael. If I speak like this into the microphone, can people still hear me, or is that too low-tech?
All right, we see the top of your head, so you got to actually lower it. There you go. Good.
There we go. Right. Well, apologies from our side. This is a general cut, but we've still got the mobile internet working on our side. It's actually an apt point that the second and third industrial revolutions have not reached everywhere. I guess my key point here is we need to work much harder on ensuring that the knowledge and infrastructure and skills around different technologies is transmitted, and not just the opportunity for consumption of those technologies. And my warning is not to be seduced by stories of leapfrogging as if it's a magical thing that happens if you give people a consumer device, but rather to focus on thinking of a knowledge system around a technology and infrastructure as consisting of skills, experience, the ability to create and reinvent. We kind of instinctively know that. The question is, how do you do that? And for the first time in 10 years on working in these issues, I have the World Intellectual Property Organization saying we need to explore new international models of IP collaboration and regulation, which is very, very hopeful in this question of how we do better tech transfer in this industrial revolution.
I have to engage my core holding up this thing, so make your answers short.
Okay.
Okay, the next question, Nick, is why have international governments scrutinized cryptocurrency so heavily, yet you believe that they're extremely important for the future?
Cryptocurrencies have been scrutinized both because they're extremely dangerous for consumers and because they're dangerous in multiple ways. They're dangerous in that they can be manipulated. Even the Bitcoin blockchain, which is presumed to be secure because of the amount of activity on it, it's really controlled only by four mining pools, all of which are based in China, and all of which amount to more than 50% of the mining capacity for the chain. So theoretically, even the Bitcoin blockchain is at risk. It's when you're talking about an entirely new way of transferring value and storing value, I think it's only natural that the nation state needs to get into this. We're seeing the development of new currencies and digital currencies by Sweden and many other countries at the moment. There hasn't been enough focus in the economics of those systems, and if you're a kind of a financial expert or economist in this area, one of the key issues here is how you work with the money supply of a digital currency. So there, I think that it does need to be scrutinized. It's important because of the underlying distributed infrastructure, but I don't necessarily think that Bitcoin is the future.
Okay, I'm going to two more questions because I don't have the stamina to hold this much longer. How will cost-effective energy sources such as coal and petroleum continue to fuel technological progress, and as they've done during the first three industrial revolutions?
Look, there's two fantastic reasons why they will continue to fuel technological progress. One of which is the already existing built infrastructure and lifespan of coal burning plants, as well as the existing stock of petroleum-based transport equipment and infrastructure around the world. The lifespan of that and does not incentivize for many people investment. Neither does the variable cost and payback period for in countries that have ample supply of these of those resources. So that's completely natural, I think. So there's the stock aspect, and there's the second aspect, which is we're still not crossing the line in terms of energy density for many situations here. While we're starting to cross the line in the usability of batteries in terms of range in passenger, where the energy density of fossil fuels is the killer app, as it were. However, we are seeing a good switch, and we do need to find better ways to cost the externalities of those technologies. We know from previous industrial revolutions the damage they can do to air quality. We need to continue to think about that in the long term.
Okay, and finally, the last question is, where do you decide to draw the lines between each industrial revolution? Would it not be logical to say that the Industrial Revolution is an ongoing process?
Yeah, and I'll just mention, just because I've seen a couple of the other highly rated questions, I will say, yes, energy storage will be a major part of the fourth industrial revolution, and a battery breakthrough could be the major disruption in this area. And governance does need to be more international, so just addressing those two. Drawing the lines between each industrial revolution is itself a bit of a problematic Western-based stance, because obviously I'm looking at this as an Australian educated in the UK and living in Switzerland, and each industrial revolution is being experienced in different ways in different times around the world. However, I'm drawing the line, and Professor Schwab and I have looked carefully at where we draw the line with a number of economic historians, based on when the dominant global infrastructure for energy, transport, communication and production starts to switch in a new direction. So we can say that while there are 600 million smallholder farmers around the world that do not yet use fossil fuels and mechanized agriculture, the fact that the majority of the world's food is produced using artificial fertilizer today would suggest that most of the world is in the second industrial revolution for agriculture, and we're starting to see a shift in agriculture towards the third industrial revolution, the digitization and processing of much information. And in Australia, with the use of satellite sensing technology, robotic seeding, we've had GPS driving our tractors for decades now. We're looking at the fourth industrial revolution starting to impact in that sector. So it's very much a judgment call, but for us, it's that, Michael, it's that systems perspective that you're looking at, and it's really looking at the dominant global systems perspective. It's why we're nowhere near deep within the fourth industrial revolution yet. We're still struggling with the emergence of the third industrial revolution in most of the world.
Great. Well, Nick, I'm going to actually cradle you in my arm now, which is kind of an unusual circumstance.
It wasn't on the run sheet.
No, it wasn't in the run sheet, but it's a personal thing. Ladies and gentlemen, I think you all agree that it was an interesting experience tonight, as the evening wore on. I'd like to draw a close and pronounce an end to the 2018 Mitsubishi Minerals Sustainability Lecture. In closing, I'd like to express my thanks to Mitsubishi for their continued support for UNSW. They support minerals tertiary education at UNSW through all sorts of different initiatives, including undergraduate scholarships, education infrastructure, as well as the public lecture that we've all enjoyed. What I'd like to do is to invite Professor Paul Hagen, who is representing the head of school today, or for the week, to finally thank Nick, the speaker. Nick, I'm going to move out of the way here. I can hand you to Paul, though.
Nick, it's customary to shake hands with the speaker, so thank you for being with us tonight and your time in the afternoon in Switzerland. I was just thinking, with the technology we're seeing here tonight with Nicholas, he's delivering it in a 2D format. I don't think it'll be too far off that we won't be having Nick projected on a screen that you saw here, and hopefully with the Industrial Revolution will develop that we will have better or more continuous screening of Nick, but we'll see him in a 3D or some sort of hologram in the future. And that hopefully will not be too far off, which will be deliver even greater clarity, and that will save you the trip across the half the world to get here in Australia, and open up the world even more as a global entity. So I'd like to thank Nick for firstly agreeing to participate in this lecture. It's wonderful actually to see such a great turnout, and it's, I suppose, just symptomatic that how important sustainability is becoming and how high it is on the agenda for everyone to actually turn up tonight. I think, Michael, we've got a record turnout here in the auditorium, and I'm also told that there was another 40 or so people who actually registered and looking at the lecture online as well. So it's a huge turnout, and I think, Nick, it's a credit to you in terms of the topic that you're involved in, and talking to some of the colleagues at the back, you really know your topic, and I can see the passion in it. So we really appreciate you taking the time to deliver the message, and there's quite a few messages in there about the challenges and the risks facing us in the future. But the end point, as Michael mentioned as well, is that it comes down to leadership, and leadership on so many different levels. It comes down to the people and how well we'll be able to deliver on in this fourth revolution. My questions I put to Nick is, if we're now in the fourth revolution, what's the fifth revolution going to be like, and when's that going to be starting? But that's a whole debate which we can have over the drinks. Which brings me to my final remarks. So with this, we'd like to conclude, and again, thank you for turning up, and Nick for turning up tonight. We'll now follow with the second part of this event, and that's the cocktail function. And could I ask those who have got a name badge to make your way out in the foyer, where we can participate in the second part of the function tonight, and have a chin wag over a wine or two. Those people who don't have a badge, the door's there, out the building, as quickly as possible. So, reception in here. The drinks are coming here. Okay, so those with badges, outside. Everyone with a badge, you're most welcome to stay on. Again, thank you very much. Thank you, Michael. Well done.
Thanks.
Thank you, Nick.
Just as a reminder, if you want to have a one-on-one with Nick, I'm more than happy to hand you the iPad. Thank you very much.